Hi everybody, in today's video we are going to see how to subtly render a design sketch and how to explore while keeping the essence of the sketch inside Vizcom. And this will be a card design related example, so I'll quickly give it a name as card design, set up the studio, landscape canvas, and now we can upload a sketch. If we have, for example, a doodle or a sketch on a paper, we can just put it into Photoshop. So if we have the sketch prepared inside Photoshop, after like scanning it in with a phone, for example, we can just simply take it from the Photoshop canvas by Ctrl A, Ctrl C, and I can just Ctrl V into the Vizcom platform, and I can similarly go back to Photoshop by Ctrl C, Ctrl V, super easy clipboard functionality that we can use. Awesome, now it already created a prompt description for us. What I'll do is I copy this one, I move outside to the infinite canvas view, I connect a prompt box, copy the prompt description here, to have the initial exploration and see what it's capable of rendering out of this relatively dirty authentic PAM sketch. So maybe let's use 80% for the drawing influence here, and let's go through on all palettes, all the palettes that Vizcom can offer, and see what it's able to create out of this. And after it made the renderings, we can just simply review which could be the best approach to take here. So let's see, this was the Vizcom general. This is actually a pretty cool one, just we had some misinterpreted surfaces down here. We got the surface sculpt, which really puts the emphasis on the upper body, the surface itself. And with the other styles, we'll probably see that it's misinterpreting it. It wouldn't understand that much what we are going for here. There are some interesting interpretations, but overall it's quite messy if you just want to create a rendering out of the sketch. As I said, this is a cool interpretation, but we might want to take a bit more control, might want to be a bit lighter. So we might want to be a bit lighter with the actual renderings as opposed to just generating something with full palette influence. And that's what I want to show today, is that now if I go back to this sketch, I find the palette influence percentage here. I just put back the prompt description. And so the palette influence is going to determine how strongly it's going to apply the palette's aesthetic. So how strongly I want to have a rendering on top of the sketch. So if I leave it at 100%, we can see we get a lot of like fully rendered results. But since the sketch is not that clean, it has a lot of like misinterpretations. But by lowering down on this palette influence, let's go to 25% here. And with the drawing influence, we can still keep it high, maybe 90%. But essentially, it's going to provide a much lighter, a very subtly rendered effect that we can move forward with. And we can keep rendering on top of it to get to a more desired result. But here we can see with the lowered palette influence, it just like applies a very light shading on top of it. And we can start exploring and start generating the renderings with this very light effect by lowering down on the palette influence. And I'm going to use the Vizcom general, maybe surface sculpt as well. And I'll build up a visual one by one by just generating with low palette influence. And you can always add to the actual layers panel the generated renderings. And if you click on the X, now it's going to be the top layer. So when you click on generate once again, it's going to render on top of this. And as you generate more and more renderings, it will gain more and more fidelity, quality, and sense of depth on the image. You can essentially stop at a point that you like, and you can take advantage of the sketching functionality, which I'll do in a second. I'm just going to see which is a desirable shape for us. So I'm just going to add this. It's like a nice fluid sketchy style. But what I can do now is I can either keep on generating more renderings, that could be one angle to take, but I'm also going to just sketch over it and define some other areas. Since the sketch was pretty rough in the first place, we might want to clean up some parts. But as you can see, I started generating and I get a much more intelligent overall like surface quality. I'll just click on the X on this now and I'll start sketching over it. I highly recommend also using the magic eraser, which is located here under eraser, magic eraser. Make sure to click on the layer that is actually visible on the canvas, usually the top layer. And now we can start like cleaning up different areas, different artifacts that are coming from the original sketch, by the way. For example, this center line wasn't an intended design feature here, so we can also clean this up. And then we can identify quite a bit of details that we might want to remove here. And now I can just create a new layer, use the brush tool to now like sketch over on these. And you can also set up the brush in a desired way by right clicking. And for example, I can tweak the hardness to make a softer brush, or I can set up any other settings as well. But for example, I'm gonna just do this here. Just defining this area a bit more, and then I can use the eraser, of course, to clean it up. I want to have a harsher highlight here, or stronger. And I also want to define this as a cabin. This could be a nice galving door, for example. Now I also want to define this front mask a bit more. So new layer, and just putting in this black color here. Okay, now after defining this sketch a bit more by sketching over on the geometry, we can continue essentially the rendering process. So we can go back to this palette influence, and now I can just generate once again with high drawing influence to basically just refine everything together. It can already be a nice sketch if you wanna stop at this point, but then if you generate on top of it, now we can refine it further, and we can have a geometry which perhaps is a bit more integrated, let's say. And we can slowly refine everything together into the cohesive aesthetic here. We can go up in fidelity a little bit, so I just increased the palette influence to 35% to maybe explore a bit more details, a bit more realism on top of the sketch. Okay, I like some of these surface additions, so I'm probably gonna end up going towards this direction. I really like this, what it did with the overall structure and surface. We might want to clean up some parts with Magic Eraser, for example, this hole here. But now the upper part seems to be quite nice. Maybe I could fix on this one. That's super important, but let's see. I'm just gonna color block it to make this shape a bit more continuous. That's all right. At this point, what I'll do is I grab the selection tool, and here I only select this lower portion. So only the wheels and some of the wheel arches, because I want to have a bit more defined wheels. So that's what I'm gonna do here. I say off-road wheels and tires, and that should be good. Maybe we can say futuristic. And we can still explore lower palette influence numbers here with this option, but I lower down on the drawing influence to allow a bit more freedom to construct in like more defined wheels and not necessarily stick to these wheels which can work for a sketch. But if you want to have a bit more texture, a bit more realism here, we can definitely do that. This is going to be a nice step forward in terms of realism, so I might take this one merely because of the far side wheel is obviously much more defined. I can add it and I can still keep reiterating. I can try different styles such as the exterior that can also result in nice, more sketchy finished wheels, just like this one. That's pretty cool that it's rendered here. Yeah, also I quite like this. Quite like this set of wheels. I can add this. And I can always flip the canvas to check on the overall perspective proportion. Something like this could work, and of course I can grab the move tool to maybe elongate it even better, even more, or I can also use this Q tool. For example, now I noticed that I might need to give it a bit more of an angle to maybe fix the stance just a little bit. Something like this could work quite nicely. And now of course we can explore the different details. I can also create another high-level rendering without selecting any of the parts basically, but let's just hide the previous layer, and here, yeah, let's go with this one, but I still want to have an overall rendering to get everything together sort of into a cohesive aesthetic. So that's what I'll do. I'm gonna go to render. We can still keep it very high on the influence. Maybe I just use something which is 90% here, and then I can either go low, with the palette influence and just see the effect, if it can hit the effect what I'm aiming to get. Or I can of course go upper at the palette influence to up the fidelity, the overall rendering fidelity. Okay, I like this approach because it changed a few details, such as the far side of this light assembly got a bit more angular, a bit more defined. I like this more rugged approach, and it overall made a more cohesive rendering that we can use. So I can do this one. Alternatively, I can also go up in the fidelity as I mentioned. So I try rendering that way too. And maybe now I want to have a white futuristic concept vehicle with black cabin in the middle, just to emphasize this duality in color. And then now we can start rendering according to this aesthetic. Okay, and now at 100% we can get this duality of the black and white colors. And now we can explore those renderings with more fidelity essentially. So what I'll do actually is I go back to this stage and I'll just go back here and I create a 3D model out of this rendering because it was quite a defined shape. I'm gonna also create a 3D model out of this, and essentially I can take it and create a background scene to it as well. So what I'll do is I'll select the portion where I want to see the background. So this is going to be the part of the background. I can always add to the selection by holding down Shift, but I'll just use the lasso to define this area. And then after that, I can use color blocks, for example, to define the mountains. So for example, let's use this like black color, and I just lower on the opacity and start erasing this out to form the mountains. Yeah, something like this can be totally fine. And I can say mountains in the background of the vehicle. Okay. And now we can try in the Vizcom General V2 and let's generate the mountains. So I also go a bit lower on the drawing influence since I have selected the background part. I only want that to change. Pretty cool, we got some backgrounds, but what I want to show here is that if I were to go to the automotive exterior style, that can generate some really beautiful sketch-like mountains as opposed to something which is realistic in the Vizcom General. So I recommend the auto exterior for this reason as well, because we can get some pretty nice mountains. I can just add this. I can even, of course, go pretty high on the palette influence to use the full power of the palette to create the visual, and after that I can play with the opacity as well. Okay, this one is cool, and we can move forward with it. Of course, if I were to isolate this layer, I can always go back to the original one, which was, I believe, this. And so I can determine how strongly I want to have this effect with the help of the layer opacity. And I can also clean up the edges a little bit. So with this layer, I can also just start erasing the simple eraser tool. Maybe I can set it to soft. And this part is what I want to erase a little bit. And we can always take this visual and get back to the original prompt, which was a angular futuristic off-road vehicle. And we can just give this addition that was in the prompt, that mountains in the background. There we go. And now we can create another like cohesive rendering. If you want to do that, I can just maybe get back to the Vizcom General, or we can render in whatever style we prefer to render in. And here now we get something which is quite cohesive as a visual. And if I want to put in a persona, that's also pretty possible. Feel free to just click on the plus icon and you will find a human model that you can just use for these visualizations. It will be down here somewhere. And then you have a person that you can just put into the visuals. You can also set the focal length to make it fit the actual angle. And now we have to just determine the position, do something like this. It could work. And then I can use the selection tool to just realize him inside this scene, roughly selecting the human, maybe leaving a little bit of room for the shadows as well. And then we can say guy standing next to the vehicle. I recommend generating humans in the Vizcom General style, but we can use high drawing influence since the shape is not really going to change. We have a very a defined input by the help of the 3D model. It's not just a rough sketch where we would want to go lower on the influence. We can use high drawing influence in this case. And maybe it's like, since it's quite an adventurous vehicle, we can always prompt for the person to be adventurous as well. So let's say it's a hiker guy, and we can lower down on the drawing influence a bit. Hopefully that's going to influence the look and feel. This is going to be nice. And the cool thing is that it even sort of tried to match the lighting together. So we can see that the light is coming from this angle, and it tried its best to implement it into the overall scene. An alternative what I can also show on that is that if you want to just have like colored blocked humans, for example, essentially I can always use the actual 3D models to just copy paste the 3D models to make an image. So this is an image layer out of the 3D model, and now I can isolate it. If I isolate it by holding down Option or Alt on a keyboard while clicking on the eye icon, I can now set this to multiply. It's going to make it black. And I can create an export out of this to have this black human layer that I can just simply put back in. So I can just also use the 3D models as like a color blocked human silhouette as well. And of course I can make it any color with the help of the paint bucket tool. So for example, maybe this scene would suit a white interpretation of a human. So I can definitely do that here. And then I can determine the actual opacity of it, but essentially we can also visualize humans this way. Awesome, that will be one of the scenes that we can see. And lastly for this, I just want to put the original sketch on top. Move to top, and I modified a little bit on the actual proportions, and that's why it's not entirely fitting the sketch itself. But it's just very cool to see that it still kept the original sketch's stance and proportion. So it's pretty cool that at the end of the workflow, we can still retain the essence of the sketch, especially at these earlier stages where I didn't even modify the actual proportions of the rendering. We can see that it's exactly on top of, we are exactly working on package, and we are just like refining, introducing fidelity, or rendering this out and exploring at the same time. We can also take advantage of the 3D models. So essentially I can just set up different views with the help of the 3D model. I can also control focal length to make more dramatic views. Maybe that's a bit overly dramatic, so let's go to 20, which is quite close to the human like focal length. So we can set up a view like this, maybe to have a bit more sight on the actual back view too. And now I can generate with either lowered palette influence, or I can also use higher palette influence for more details, a more dramatic effect overall. And essentially, don't forget that we'll have a black background in the alpha channel, but we can still continue the exploration on the back side of the vehicle, which is quite cool here. And I can add it, can still generate on top of it, even sketch on top of it, and start defining other areas. But essentially, we build this up quite nicely, and I'll just do a few detail shots, and we are basically good to go. And if I want to have a bit of resemblance with the front part of the vehicle, I can also sketch in these three lines here as the tail light. Something like that. Now I can generate one final rendering. And here we go. This could be a cool back view for us. And let's get back to the 3D model, because I have plans about the front part as well. So let's grab the 3D and maybe let's set another more dramatic front view too. Yeah, this can be quite a cool perspective for us here. So let's do the same thing. Awesome. Now let's just set up the front view as well, and let's render something similarly rugged that we had in the rear view. And this just allows us a lot of freedom to start specifying different details and very quickly take different shots, set up different perspectives, so we can start like sketching over, regenerating on top of the 3D models to essentially have a more defined idea about the shape that maybe we want to build in Blender. This can just support that workflow really nicely. So I'm quite satisfied here with the front shape. What I can also do is I can just Control C this layer. I can go out to the infinite canvas, And I can Control V here. And I will just put out the previous rear view as well. So Control C, Control V. And it is quite similar to if I were to create renders inside Blender out of a created geometry, but it's not yet a final geometry. This can just give us a lot of cool ideas about what we want to build. And here I can either expose back this rendering as the alternative rendering that we had, but of course I can also do the same thing with the 3D model that I can just expose multiple views on the same page as well. So instead of this very dramatic view, we can go back to maybe 30% focal length. And maybe I also just display a front view, which tells a bit more about the shape. And I can duplicate this to set up the rear view as well. Maybe let's do something like this. Let's use the same prompt, and we can of course explore with a more cohesive package as well. Perhaps it's even faster if you just display the two views on the same page, because the exploration that we can have is a bit more rapid, and it can also just automatically match together the different views, which is a very nice effect that we can enjoy in Vizcom. So now the colors and some of the graphic elements will be identical between the two views, since we use them on the same canvas and we render them at the same time. So maybe I like this direction where it already added in these three, sort of like 3 lines as the tail light as well. It's a pretty cool touch, and now I can just generate on top of it. And of course, ladies and gentlemen, the exploration is endless. We can generate as many views as we want, and we can still keep refining and iterating on this shape. Or of course, we can settle with a few views as well. So I'll also just take this rendering, and now we have a lot of really cool visualizations that we can start the Blender modeling workflow on top. Maybe I also just expose the original sketch that we had. Nice, so just exposed here the original sketch as well. And notice how it can keep the actual character of the sketch throughout each of the renderings and turning it into a 3D model. So it's a super effective workflow of just going through on this process of very lightly rendering on top of the actual sketch to have this very gentle effect as you build on top, sketch on top of the renderings. And you can get to a point where you're satisfied with the actual shape and you have like decent amount of control to give you some good ideas for the actual 3D modeling workflow if you need to build a 3D model. That's what I basically wanted to cover, so I highly encourage you to take advantage of the lowered palette influences, because it can just keep the essence of your sketch much more, and it can also offer a much more controlled process overall. So I hope it was useful, and let me know if you have any questions regarding this workflow, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.